You guys have heard of the saying, history is written by the victors, and indeed it is. It is the victors that are granted a chance to determine the destiny and fate of our world. Because of this, history is largely biased in a way in which certain wars are prioritized and taught more than others. How would the world be different today if the British had won the American War of Independence, or if the Americans had won the Vietnam War? One of the most popular topics of alternate history is that of the Allies losing in the Second World War and the Axis victorious. We even see books and TV shows like The Man in the High Castle, which is set in a post-World War II era in which Nazis and the Japanese control America. This is no surprise though, as World War II was the biggest and deadliest conflict in human history. But what about other wars? Wars that are less talked about, but arguably just as consequential as the ones that are generally known. Today, we look at 4 unknown wars that had profound impacts in history. Also, if you guys like our channel, please consider subscribing and turning notifications on. This is a relatively new channel, and I'm always trying to post high quality videos routinely. I'd also appreciate any form of feedback, positive or negative. With that being said, let's get into the video. Did you know that Japan has never been invaded? This fact is the reason why Japanese culture is so distinct and unique, even compared to their Chinese or Korean counterparts. What if Japan was invaded in the past? Would they still have tried to conquer all of Asia like they did in the early 20th century? You see, the reason why the Japanese government was able to justify this war to their people was through reinforcing this idea that Japanese society and culture was superior, and especially compared to those of their Asian neighbors. Soon after Kublai Khan's ascension to the throne, the Mongol Empire turned their eyes east on Japan. Historically, Japan has always been linked to China through political, cultural, and economic ties, even as far as becoming a tributary state. To the Mongols, taking Japan means legitimizing their rule to their Chinese subjects and as a dynasty. Khan at first sent an envoy requesting that the Japanese emperor come to his court in order to pay tribute, but the Japanese emperor ignored him. The Khan's diplomatic attempts would end up being in vain as the Japanese refused to acknowledge the yuan. The Mongols soon began building a fleet in preparation for a large naval invasion against the Japanese. The Mongols were superior in numbers and arguably military prowess. However, both invasion attempts were ultimately failures due to unexpected storms that destroyed the Mongolian fleet. These winds were fictionalized into the country's history, with the Japanese calling it kamikaze. Some historians argue that these winds were a pivotal moment in which Japanese identity was established, as these winds convinced the Japanese that heaven was on their side. Not only was the failed invasion symbolic in Japanese history, but it proved to the world that the Mongolian Empire was not invincible. Picture this. If the Japanese were invaded, Japan would have officially become a part of the Chinese Empire, which could suggest that the Japanese, Chinese, and even Mongolian identities would have been integrated over time. The fall of the Russian Empire and the Bolshevik victory in 1917 marked the world's first communist country to be established. Vladimir Lenin's rise to power was a brutal time period in Russian history, in which constant violence, political oppression, and social upheaval occurred. Russia's southern neighbor Ukraine, or at this time known as the Ukrainian People's Republic, was beginning to feel threatened by the Bolsheviks' growing power. The UPR was a new state that had just claimed independence from Russia a few years ago. However, their time would be short-lived as their more powerful neighbors in Poland and Russia disputed their territories. The UPR ended up creating an alliance with the Polish against the Bolsheviks. In 1919, the Polish government believed it was time for them to push east in an effort to establish new Polish territories and a sphere of influence, while Lenin believed that if Poland were to fall under Bolshevik control, more and more revolutions would take place throughout Europe. In the beginning of the war, the Polish were successful in their offensive, as they were able to take and occupy the Ukrainian city of Kiev on May 7, 1920. This occupation would be short-lived, however, as the Russians would initiate a successful counteroffensive, retaking the city and pushing the Polish all the way back to their capital in Warsaw. By the summer of 1920, the fall of Warsaw seemed certain, and Russian victory was just on the horizon. However, the Polish ended up achieving a miraculous victory in the Battle of Warsaw, and the tide of war was once again turned. In light of these events and an eastward pushing Polish army, the Russians would eventually sue for peace, and a treaty was signed on March 18, 1921. The First World War had just ended in Europe a few years prior, and the region was already suffering from growing social unrest, political tension, and economic instability. With so much chaos going on, communist sentiments were already growing amongst the masses within Western Europe. With the Soviets at their doorsteps,
A Polish loss would have likely meant more and more communist states would have been established. A communist Europe would have been followed by the rest of the world following suit.
China's economic growth in the last few decades has been unmatched by any other country. Their growth has sparked growing tensions between the US and China, two countries that are ideologically opposed to one another. Many have always wondered, how would global international relationships, particularly in Asia, be like if the Chinese communists had lost the war? Some believe that China would have ended up more like a modern Taiwan, Japan, or South Korea, while others believe that China, under a nationalist government, would have been no different than it is today. Many know of the deadly Chinese Civil War that was fought between the Chinese nationalists and the communists. What many don't know is the less talked about Taiping Rebellion, an uprising that results in an estimate of 20 million deaths. This conflict was by far the deadliest in modern Chinese history, as the death toll surpassed that of the Sino-Japanese War and the Chinese Civil War. It all started in the year 1827, when a man named Han Shu-tran was preparing to take the government civil service exam, an exam that granted a person a position within the Chinese bureaucracy. However, Han would not pass the exam and even failed to obtain the lowest official degree. Han would go on to fail the exam 2 more times in the next 10 years, with the last failure causing him to go into depression and emotional collapse. In this hysteria, Han would experience a psychedelic-like vision that convinced him that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ and was sent by God in order to rid the world of evil. In the year 1851, Han would declare a new dynasty, the Taiping Tianguo, and himself the Tianwang, or Heavenly King. Han would soon begin to amass followers, many of whom were peasants and farmers who were attracted to his propaganda against the current Qing government, claiming them to be foreigners from Manchuria. The Taiping's popularity was growing exponentially, and for the next 2 years will undergo a military campaign with an army that composed of rebels that came from the lower class. This uprising would result in the capture of several cities, and most importantly, the port city of Nanjing. In the year 1853, Nanjing was established as the Taiping capital, and their march had come to a halt, although they would still undergo several more smaller campaigns in the north. In the next 7 years, the Taipings would suffer from internal conflict that weakened the group's cause, which prompted many followers to leave the city. By 1864, the city of Nanjing would fall, and the Qing would retake the city, with Han refusing to flee and instead committing suicide. The Taiping Rebellion had caused so much destruction that the Qing government would never recover from it and become permanently weakened. Even more unfortunate for the Chinese was that this rebellion took place during the century of humiliation, in which the ever-growing Western powers and Japan sought to exploit and establish influence over China. What if the Qing never collapsed? If the Qing were never weakened from the Taiping Rebellion, there's no denying that there would have been a very strong possibility that the Qing would have had enough resources to subdue the nationalist and communist rebellions early on. We hear that historians argue that nationalist China would have been the same as the communists. But what of a modern Qing China? How would a Qing China have done in the war against the Japanese? And most importantly, would a modern Qing China have been in a similar economic and political position as the current communist China? These are all questions that would remain forever unanswered, but nonetheless very interesting to think about. We've all heard of the French and German rivalry. It's an old enmity between the two countries that had driven tensions behind the First and Second World War. When did this rivalry start, and how did it factor into the politics of Europe? Some historians point all the way back to the times of the Roman Empire, where Julius Caesar noted a rivalry between the Gauls and the Germanic tribes, two tribes that would evolve into the French and German countries. Others point back to the times of the Holy Roman Empire. However, this animosity between the two nations truly first intensified between the 18th and 19th centuries, in which a series of conflicts, most notably the Franco-Prussian War, came to set the stage for an inevitable world war between the two European powerhouses. It all started in the year 1866, when Prussia's defeat over Austria in the 7 Years' War had solidified Prussian control over the Germanic states, a position that threatened French hegemony within the European continent. At this time, France, under the rule of King Napoleon III, still had aspirations of a greater French Empire within Europe, an empire that included the Germanic territories. These conflicts of interest caused growing tensions between the two countries, and both sides knew that war was inevitable. However, neither side wanted to declare war first, as the risk of being the aggressor could have meant the possible interventions of other European powers. In 1870, the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck suggested that Prince Leopold, a Prussian noble, take the seat of the new Spanish crown. This suggestion alarmed the French, who were worried that this move would threaten their geopolitical position between the Spanish and the Germans. A French diplomat was soon sent to Prussia to meet with King Wilhelm I, in which the French demanded that the Germans rescind this move and never try to reinstate Leopold to the Spanish crown again. In the next following days, King Wilhelm would submit a letter to Bismarck detailing the exchange between him and the diplomat. Bismarck would then doctor this letter in a manner that was intended to provoke the French, and had it telegraphed on July 13, 1870. Nearly a week after the telegram, the enraged French would declare war on Prussia on July 19, 1870. The French, confident in their recently reorganized army, along with new additions of military technology, believed that this war was greatly in their favor. The Prussians, on the other hand, conscripted an additional 900,000 men on top of their 300,000 strong army, giving them a numerical advantage over the French. Furthermore, Bismarck's gamble came to fruition when the southern German states aligned themselves with the Prussians because they saw France as the aggressors. This numerical and political edge gave the Germans one final advantage: their mobility. The Prussians, with their utilization of the railway, were able to deploy their large army quickly and effectively, allowing them to constantly be on the offensive. Battles took place all over the French-German border, with the Germans winning a majority of them. The decisive victory took place on September 1st in Sedan, in which the Germans defeated the French army and captured Napoleon III. This defeat would prompt chaos back in Paris, in which the monarchy was overthrown and the French Third Republic was established. The Germans would then lay a devastating siege on Paris for the next 5 months, with the French finally surrendering on January 28, 1871. Following the French defeat and the Treaty of Frankfurt, the French had to pay war reparations of up to 5 million francs and concede the region of Alsace-Lorraine to the Germans. These devastating provisions would intensify the hostility between the French and the Germans, and continue on to the early 20th century, in which the French will make similar demands of the Germans following the end of the First World War. This cycle would then lead again to the rise of the German Third Reich and World War II.